Solitaire Rose Radio, Episode 34, A History of EC Comics, Part 2, Tales from the Crypt, Part 1. If you look back through the archives of Solitaire Rose Radio, you'll see that on June 5th, 2004, is when I put up a Personal History of EC Comics Part 1. That's Solitaire Rose Radio 18, where I go over the history of the publisher. And I said in that episode that I would then go back and go through each series. And yes, I suck. I've taken a year to get to the next part. But to make up for it, I'm going to be going through these fairly quickly. Well, quickly for me. I'm going to do at least one a month, and maybe two a month. And with me recording 4 of the solo podcasts every month, that means, well, we'll get through it a lot quicker than if I would have done it at my old pace, which is one every year. If you've not heard that episode, I encourage you to go back and listen to it before you start listening to the further EC stuff. One of the things you're going to notice is that I go through the entire history of EC in that hour. But another thing is, you may hear things in these episodes that contradict some of the things in that episode. And the reason for that is, I call it a personal history. This is the stuff that I know, the stuff that I have learned, the stuff that I have read in interviews and on like that. And as you research more, one of the things I've learned with doing episodes like this and the Kirby stuff is you can fall right down that rabbit hole of research. There's so much research available now. There's so many interviews available now. There's so many experts who are posting stuff on the internet that's just brilliantly done, where they go back and they're able to get information that we didn't have back in the 80s or the 90s or even the early 2000s, because more and more information is becoming available. So if I contradict myself, it means that the information I found out back then may not have been correct, and the information I have now, hopefully, is more correct. I wanted to start with Tales from the Crypt, because Tales from the Crypt is the EC comic that people know. Now, people know Mad, but they don't know Mad used to be a comic, and they don't think of it as EC, because EC really didn't emphasize the EC publishing name in Mad. It was just Mad. Nobody thought it. They knew William Gaines and Al Feldstein back in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And many of the artists on Mad started as EC artists. But when you say Tales from the Crypt, people know that. It's partly because of the TV series, partly because they did a cartoon spin-off of it. There was even a movie in the 70s. When you mention the Crypt Keeper, people have that visual in mind. Tales from the Crypt kind of has seeped into the American consciousness of pop culture in a way that the Vault of Horror and the Haunt of Fear did not. Maybe it's something about the name. Maybe it's the fact that it was picked for the TV show. But even back in the 50s, Tales from the Crypt was EC's best-selling title until Mad dethroned it. Even though the horror books were kind of interchangeable in a lot of ways, Tales from the Crypt always seemed to outsell. Gaines didn't have an explanation other than he thought that it was a very good title, and he got very lucky with picking that title. Because, as we go into it, that was not the original title of the book. When you go to pick up the early issues of Tales from the Crypt, first off, it's Crime Patrol and International Crime Patrol. So if you're looking for Tales from the Crypt number 1, you're not going to find it. You're going to find Crime Patrol and International Crime Patrol. If you're looking for the first horror issue, and you're going to Tales from the Crypt, well, the first issue is number 17, and it's the Crypt of Terror. Modern readers who are used to books being canceled and started over with a new number 1 probably won't understand. But back in the back up until I would say the 70s, and maybe even a little into the 80s with DC, newsstand dealers and subscriptions were the main way comics were sold. And newsstand dealers they had limited space. So they, in a lot of ways, they wouldn't put out a number one issue. If you look at number one issues in the 50s, especially, if it's the first issue, they may not even have an issue number on the cover. Or if they do, it's really de-emphasized. It's not till the 70s that it's number one. It becomes a big deal because then you had the collectors coming in and buying number one issues. But for subscriptions, you would buy a second-class mailing permit, which was not overly expensive, but expensive enough when your profit margin is tiny. So what they would do when they would cancel a book, rather than completely cancel it and start a new book with a new number one, they would change the title, but keep the numbering. And the reason they would do that, partly so that, oh, this comic's been around for 30-some issues. It must be okay. I'll stock it on the shelf at the news dealer. And at the post office, International Crime Patrol became Crime Patrol, became Crypt of Terror, became Tales from the Crypt. Most of the time, publishers would not get caught doing this because the post office didn't care that much. If they did notice, they would make you change. They would make you buy a new second-class mailing permit, and in doing that, a lot of publishers would then just change the numbering to what it should be. But that's why when you look for early issues of Tales from the Crypt, you're not going to find any till issue 20. It was the second-class postage thing. William Gaines, who I talked about a lot in the first episode, really didn't want to be a comic book publisher. And in becoming a comic book publisher, he was carrying on his father's business. And one of the things he decided was he wanted to do stuff that he enjoyed. He wanted to do comics that he liked doing. He tried doing stuff like his father did. His father had worked for All American Comics, was co-owner of All American Comics, which was a partner with National, which became DC. And he finally sold his characters and his interest over to DC. So the Justice Society and all of those characters became known by national periodicals, DC. And he only kept picture stories from the Bible, picture stories from the Old Testament, picture stories from the New Testament, and a comic called Land of the Lost, which was based on a radio series. And when he passed, William Gaines looked around and said, oh, crime seems to sell, romance seems to sell, let's try that. And in editor Al Feldstein, he found someone he got along with very, very well. And they were both big fans of radio horror. Series like Inner Sanctum, Suspense, Lights Out. And in a lot of ways, these were classic horror tales. They were Edgar Allan Poe-ish horror tales. It wasn't vampires and zombies and what we think of as horror now. It was a tamer type of horror, and like most short stories of the time, they really relied on that twist at the end. That was sort of how short stories were written back then, which is why when people talk about Twilight Zone always was known for the big twist. That was just how short stories were done. If you read anthologies of short stories from the 50s, especially if you're reading some of the Ray Bradbury short stories, even though Bradbury was going for a more lyrical type of prose, a more idealized middle America, Midwest type of writing, his short stories, either science fiction or horror tinged, would have that twist ending. That's just how short stories were done back then. It wasn't, step 1, step 2, step 3 to conclusion. It was step 1, step 2, step 3, reveal. And this continued on up into Alfred Hitchcock's Mystery Magazine into the 70s and 80s. Short stories are an art form that seemed to be completely gone, but the few little anthologies that come out here and there, the twist ending seems to be kind of gone. It seems to be kind of thought of as passé. But back in the 50s, the twist ending was how short stories were done. And Gaines and Feldstein really enjoyed these, so they tried out a few horror stories in their crime comics. And they were happy that they went over well. Now, there's really no way for them to tell if the horror stories were what were selling the comic. But in the comic Crime Patrol, by issue 14, they introduced the Crypt Keeper in a 7-page Feldstein story called Return from the Grave. And, of course, Return from the Grave. Oh, wow, a corpse returning from the grave to get revenge. How? EC never does stories like that. No, that was EC's main motif. It was one of their main story tropes. But it must have got good mail, because in the next issue they cover featuring a story from the Crypt of Terror. And Gaines and Feldstein enjoyed doing these stories more, so the crime stories begin to have more of a horror tinge to them. They weren't like Crime Does Not Pay or Crime and Punishment, the other crime comics at the time that kind of reveled in the violent aspect of it. They were more interested in doing horror tinged crime, or crime that was more psychological based. You know, why did someone do this? So as this continued, by issue 16 of Crime Patrol was the last crime book they did. And with issue 17, it changed over to the Crypt of Terror. The Crypt of Terror had a cover featuring a woman being stalked by a werewolf by Johnny Craig. And while it had the trappings of a horror comic, it really wasn't a pure EC horror comic. They still hadn't completely switched over to horror. And as I read these stories, and I've read them a number of times over the years, I read them when I first got the EC box set of Tales from the Crypt back in the late 80s. And then again, when it was, they reprinted every EC comic in the 90s as color comics. And then by the end of the 90s, all the ones that they had in inventory, they would package up 5, bind them together, and sell them as an annual. And because the box sets are in black and white, I wanted to see this art in color, so that I had both. The collector mentality. What do I know? And besides, each one was only like $7.95 or $8.95 for that, so it was much cheaper than buying the comics themselves at $2.50 to $2.50 a pop. So I've read these stories before, and as I go back and I read the first few issues of the Crypt of Terror, they really feel like these were crime stories that were already kind of in the pipeline. But because they felt the horror was selling better, they kind of switched over. Another misconception about the Crypt of Terror number 17, a lot of people say it was the first horror comic. It wasn't. It was the first successful horror series, but there had been other horror comics in the past. Starting in 47, there were a couple horror comics. They came out, they did okay, but there was that avalanche of crime comics, and then the avalanche of romance comics. And comics tended to follow a trend. And because the horror comics didn't sell well enough, that news dealers were asking publishers for more horror comics, they really didn't take off until EC. So while EC wasn't the creator of the horror comic, they were the ones who kind of made it popular and started the horror boom. So when you go to Tales from the Crypt Crypt of Terror number 17, the cover is not by Al Feldstein, who's I think we call him the editor-in-chief. Gaines had an editor, and then by, I would say, 1952, he hired on Harvey Kurtzman as an editor. Later on, he brought on Johnny Craig as an editor. But Feldstein was kind of the editor and lead writer. And what he would do, the way their process worked is, he and Gaines would bat around ideas. Feldstein would pick the ones he wanted to work on. He'd rough out the pages, kind of, here's what to do. He would write the comic and then give it to an artist to draw, or he would draw it himself. And the story ideas that they would bat around, Gaines was addicted to diet pills, even back then. If you look at pictures of William N. Gaines from Mads, he's a large man. He loved to eat. Eating was his favorite thing in the world. And back in the 50s, he was a younger man. He was trying to be slim. And in the 50s, they would sell amphetamines as diet pills. Now, these diet pills would prove his undoing later on in front of Congress, when he would be testifying in front of Congress and he'd be crashing from the diet pills and really just get his ass handed to him during a congressional investigation into horror comics. But at this time, he was taking a lot of diet pills. And because of this, he had insomnia and he would stay up late at night. And this was before TV. This was radio would switch over to music after their programming. So he would read. He would read voraciously. He would read every magazine he could get his hands on. He would read short story collections. He would read novels. And what he would do as he read these, he would write down what he called springboards. He'd have 3x5 index cards, and he'd write down a line that might be the germ of a story idea that he would have gotten while reading these books. So he would come in, and Monday morning, according to interviews I've heard with both Feldstein and Gaines, they would sit down, go through the springboards. Feldstein would pick out the ones that he thought he could turn stories into, and he would spend the rest of the week getting those ready, getting them to artists, setting all that up. So that's how they would do their story conferences. In the early days of EC, they also had freelance writers who would work with them. The main one that people would know is Gardner Fox. Gardner Fox, who worked over at at DC Comics, working on the Justice Society, working on Hawkman, working on their superhero stuff. But he was always looking for other work, and he got work at EC in the early days, especially on the first few issues of the Crypt of Terror. So we start with the Crypt Keeper, although this is not the Crypt Keeper you would know. This is not the Crypt Keeper who's cracking wise and making fun of the story. Well, not really making fun of the story, but making fun of the character in the story and making a lot of puns. Nope. In these issues, the Crypt Keeper is very much just a straight narrator. He introduces the story, he closes the story, and in this issue, he's only in the first story. And this is one by Feldstein, so it was Feldstein had the lead section, and other artists did other stories. The easy formula was to have 4 stories and a text story. You needed to have a text story in your comics so that it was available for second-class postage. But they would do 4 stories, either 8, 7, 6, or 5 pages, depending on how the book was laid out. And the way Feldstein would lay it out is he knew, all right, I have this many pages, so this story needs to be 7, this story needs to be 6, this story needs to be 7, and this story needs to be this many. So they had a formula for how the books were done. Even Mad, which later on would throw away the formula and play with it a lot, even Mad had the 4 stories per issue. That was just how EC worked. And a lot of comics still had that anthology feel. They were getting more into a single character being in all the stories, but it was rare that you would have a story that would go an entire issue. That was still later to come. Another thing about EC, comics were all still 10 cents, but some were 64 pages, some were 52. ECs were 36 pages, which is, the comic we know now, the format we know now. So EC was competing against books that would say, more comic for your dime sort of thing. The other thing about how the books were laid out is that they would usually put the strongest story up front because they figured when a kid would pick up the book, first they'd see the cover and be intrigued by the cover, and then when they would flip through the first pages. And at the time, Gaines felt Feldstein was his #1 artist. That's the guy I want at the front of the book. He's my editor. He knows what I want. Feldstein has a very clean style. I find his work a little stiff, but it's very functional. It's very clean. It's better than most of the other comics that were being printed at the time. One of the things EC is known for is how their art was just so head and shoulders above most other companies putting books out. And they had just a killer lineup of artists that we're going to go through as we go through this series. But in these early days, Gaines had a deep love of Feldstein's art because it was very clean, it was very readable, it 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 fit the story well. And the first story is a not really a horror story. It's a crime story with some horror tinge to it. It's about a man who he and his scientist friend, they discover a way for him to keep young. It's a gland in the brain that can only be taken from corpses. There's kind of a twist at the end, but it's not that EC twist. EC is very known for the sort of horrific twist at the end. This was, as I said, very much a crime story that ended up kind of being horror themed. The second story did not have a host. There was no host for the second story. It was written by Gardner Fox and drawn by a man named Bill Fracchio, who does not show up much in any other EC books. His art is subpar, in my opinion. It really just... It doesn't hold up even in these early issues, where a lot of his characters seem more like caricatures than actual people. It's almost very, I hate to say the term comic booky, but it's very comic booky. And again, it's another crime story about an executioner who doesn't like the fact that juries are letting people off. So he's going to hunt them down, and of course he gets caught. And it could work as a horror story, but at this point EC wasn't really pushing the horrific elements that much. So it really does read like a crime story. As does the third story, The Corpse Nobody Knew. I like that name. And it's drawn by George Roussios, who, after EC, actually went over and he was best known for inking, and he even inked a lot of stuff at Marvel in the 60s. He had the nickname Inky because he inked so much work. This was another Feldstein story, and it's very much about a private detective. They find a corpse in their hotel room, and they're trying to figure out where it came from and who killed who. And in reading the story again, there are no horror elements at all. This is very much a straight detective story that probably would have been in Crime Patrol. And because they introduced the detective by name, it almost feels like it was going to be the start of a lead character in Crime Patrol. I don't know if that's true or not, but they really put a lot of emphasis on the character's name and the character himself. And it's very much a puzzle story, so at the end you figure out the puzzle that in the last two panels with the detective. The last story is the Werewolf Story, promised on the cover. It's drawn by Johnny Craig, who is one of my favorite EC artists. He's probably best known for his work on crime suspense stories, but he did a lot of work on the horror stories too. He's got a very clean line, a very good storytelling style, really good at facial expressions for people who are in inner torment. Again, there's no host for this story, but it does have a little box on it, another suspense story from the Crypt of Terror. And while it promises to be a werewolf story, it's not really a werewolf story. At the end, you find out that it was a man who thought he was a werewolf. So EC's, they're doing horror tinged stuff, but it's very almost tame horror. Probably a lot like the stuff on the radio horror stories that they enjoyed. They weren't whole hog into horror. Another thing I want to point out is that they had ads for the old educational comic stuff. And they continued to have ads and sell through mail order the educational comics, such as picture stories from American history, picture stories from the Bible, picture stories from science, picture stories from history. They must have printed a lot of these. They were larger books. They were with stiff covers. They were almost meant to be sold to schools and churches, which is what Gaines's father felt was where he was going to go. He didn't want to publish comics for newsstands that much anymore. He wanted to publish for schools and churches and stuff, and he thought that was a better market. And these ads continue all the way through to the end of EC. The next issue is still the Crypt of Terror. It's got another Johnny Craig cover, and it's I'll just read the cover blurb because the cover blurb is very cool. In this issue, they find him in a back alley and brought him to the city morgue, an unidentified cadaver, but they didn't know he was a living corpse. And on it, a man is looking at the corpse in the morgue, and the corpse's hand, unbeknownst to the man, is reaching up. Unbelievably tame cover if you look at the stuff from EC's third and fourth year, but at the time, you know, they're pushing into creating that new era of finding their way, of finding out what horror stuff they want to do. Another thing about Tales from the Crypt, also known as the Crypt of Terror, it was bi-monthly. It came out every other month for the entirety of its run. The only monthly book EC did was Mad. Even though Tales from the Crypt sold very well, it still was bi-monthly, and part of it was because they didn't want to strain themselves too much. They really wanted to keep the quality up, and Gaines was very concerned with the quality of the books once they became new trend. He cared about putting out a good product. He cared about putting out something that he liked. Part of it was because he was going for an older audience. He wanted to recapture those adults who had read comics in the 40s and had drifted away from them over the years. He saw that pulps were fading, he saw that other printed things were fading, but he remembered that soldiers really liked reading comics, so he felt if he put out a good literate product with great art, it would draw in the adults. So we start the second issue, issue 18 of the Crypt of Terror, with another Feldstein story. You got the Crypt Keeper. You got a good headshot of the Crypt Keeper. They're really kind of figuring out how they're going to draw the Crypt Keeper. Because if you look at how the Crypt Keeper was drawn in 17, the face is in shadow, his hair is covering his face up. Now we're getting more of a look at the Crypt Keeper. He's getting his look. It's not the skeletal look that you would know from the cartoon and the HBO series, but the Crypt Keeper has a very specific look. And Feldstein was very good at deciding how the horror hosts would look. They all had a look that was very unique. Again, he introduces the story. There's no puns. There's no making fun of the characters in the story. The Crypt Keeper is at the beginning and at the end, and that's it. This is another crime story with some horror tinge. And it hits on another of the EC themes. That is the love triangle. Man is in love with woman. Woman's in love with someone else. The spurned lover actually cuts off the hand of the man the woman chose, and he's a pianist. And halfway through the story, the hand of the pianist he's cut off shows up to attack the antagonist, or the bad guy of the story, and he attempts to destroy the hand. But when we get to the end, the twist is that no, the hand didn't come back. The man had gone crazy because he'd murdered someone, and he had choked himself, which is projected by the splash page, which has a copy of a book called The Telltale Heart by Edgar Allan Poe. So they pretty much tell you, hey, this is a twist that's coming. Get ready for it. They're moving more toward what we would think of as an EC comic. The second story is The Living Corpse, the one that we heard about on the cover. This one is drawn by Wally Wood. It's not the Wally Wood you would know. I had to actually go online because while Feldstein and Craig were signing their stories, no one else in the book was at this point. And other than the lettering of the title, this does not look like Wally Wood art. It's not what you would think of when you see that Wally Wood art. So Wood is still trying to find his style. And another thing about EC is that the artists were encouraged to find their own style. Whereas other companies like Archie, like DC, Atlas, um, Fawcett, they had a house style. You were to draw like this. Even the Kirby stuff, if Simon and Kirby were the main studio, the publisher would encourage everyone to draw like them. EC artists were encouraged to be individuals, to find their own individual style. And in a lot of ways, that's why there's such a big EC legacy, because the artists were signing their work, but also the artists became very individual. You knew how the artist would draw. And by the second year, if you've read EC Comics, by the second year, you could tell the artist just by looking at the first panel. But this is a Wally Wood story, and while it promises a living corpse, it really doesn't give us a living corpse. It's a morgue attendant thinks that this corpse keeps coming back to life. Of course, there's a sane and normal explanation for it. So you're getting the trappings. EC's starting to put together what they want to do. But they're not there yet. They're still not fully committed to the horror thing. And there's a lot of crime elements to this. One of the things about the EC horror is there are a lot of crime elements to their horror stuff until you get to the vampires and the werewolves and the living dead and things like that. And even then, there are crime elements. And Gaines has always shown in the EC line all the way up through the Picto-Fiction books a really strong interest in Freudian psychology. And he and Feldstein both really did a lot of work into that Freudian ideas and what was considered modern psychology in the 50s. The next story is written by Ivan Clapper, and even the Grand Comic Book Database has a question mark by his name. They're not sure if that was him. They're not sure. I know that in interviews, Feldstein said he did not write this story. And it's drawn by Harvey Kurtzman. And you can look at it, and it does not look like a Harvey Kurtzman story. Kurtzman's style is very cartoonish. He does a lot of interesting things with layout. All of his characters have a lot of curvature to them. I heard one artist tell me that he didn't think Harvey Kurtzman knew how to draw a straight line. Even his straight lines looked like they had curves to them. This is a story about a wife who her husband thinks she's going crazy, but there's a twist ending. And again, not really a horror story, more of a suspense story, more of a radio, what they call a radio suspense story. This would have been on Suspense. The final story is another Johnny Craig story. It's signed again, no host. The Crypt Keeper only shows up for the first story. It's called Mute Witness to Murder. This one is a straight crime story. There are no horror elements at all. A woman becomes mute after witnessing a murder, and because she's mute, they think she's crazy. They put her in an asylum, and the truth comes out. There's no horror element to this at all. And it's why I have a theory that they really, the switch to horror wasn't immediate. It was they had this stuff in the pipeline, and rather than just waste it, they moved the Tales from the Crypt, the Crypt of Terror up to the lead. They had already been moving in a horror direction with their crime stuff, so they're just using up kind of the crime inventory. This brings us to the third issue. Third issue is issue 19, the Crypt of Terror, the last issue of the Crypt of Terror. It will change its name. And on this one, we get a Johnny Craig cover. We've got what looks like a ghost, but we find out is actually a zombie, a voodoo zombie. When we think of zombies, we think of The Walking Dead that eat you alive. Back in the 50s, 60s, even into the 70s, when you would say zombie, people would think of Haitian voodoo, mind control, maybe reanimating the dead to do what the voodoo lord wants. So we've got our We've got another Walking Dead cover. One of the more interesting things to me is in this issue on the inside cover, we've got a thing for the first comics code. Look for this seal. Authorized ACMP, that's the Association of Comic Magazine Publishers, conforms to the comic code. This was the first attempt at a comics code, and EC was part of it. All the publishers, except the big ones like Dell and DC, were part of it. And it was kind of to head off the idea that comics were not wholesome enough for children. The crime comics had already started a bit of a backlash. People thought that they were too violent for children, but the problem was that they would sell. If you didn't have the Disney license and you didn't have Superman and you wanted a book to sell 2, 3, 4 million copies, you'd do a crime comic or you'd do a romance comic at this point. Case in point, we've also got our first EC checklist where they say, this is the books we published. The following is a complete list of EC titles, all of which bear the code seal of the Association of Comic Magazine Publishers. EC's branding now. We're at the third issue of Tales from the Crypt, or the Crypt of Terror, and they're branding. They're saying, EC, these are the comics you want to buy. Many comic publishers didn't do that. They wouldn't, if you look at Atlas, they wouldn't say, buy an Atlas comic. They would just go, buy this comic, buy this comic, buy this comic. And many of the publishers didn't even have publisher logos. But EC was very proud of its logo. They put the logo right on the cover. And an entertaining comic, changing the name from an educational comic. But the third issue, Crypt of Terror, here is what EC was publishing. EC was publishing the Crypt of Terror, the Haunt of Fear, the Vault of Horror, weird science, weird fantasy, and modern love. The romance comic was still selling well enough that they continued it. The science fiction comics had begun by this time. EC also took out a lot of ads in their own books that they were proudest of their science fiction books. The science fiction books always sold less than the horror. And later on, they went from 2 science fiction comics to 1. From what Gaines has said, the science fiction comics that were published under the new direction, which was after the comics code took effect, actually lost money. And he hoped to make it up with the other books because he just enjoyed publishing the science fiction stuff so much. Through the new trend, the horror comics sold well enough to keep the science fiction stuff afloat and have it continue, that they didn't have to worry about it as much. As long as they made a profit, Gaines was happy to continue to publish them because the horror comics were making so much money. The splash page on issue 19, we get our first full look at the Crypt Keeper. His look is still being refined, but he has the long hair. He's got the specific face. We've kind of settled on how the Crypt Keeper is going to look. They would refine it further as years went on. But Feldstein is the one who set the tone for how the Crypt Keeper looked. He introduces the story. It's another Feldstein story in the anchor position called The Ghost Ship. It is very much just a ghost story. And it's funny that EC would do these ghost stories, but by their second year in, they were just too tame for them to do. But it's a very good ghost story as ghost stories go. The next story is a story drawn by Graham Engels, although it's unsigned. You can tell Graham Engels already came in with his style. Graham Engels was probably one of the best known of the horror artists. He did other stuff, but he really shined as a horror artist. And he really excelled when he would do stories set in Victorian times, or even his modern stuff looked like it was set in the 1800s. That's just how he drew. His people looked stretched and a little deformed and almost as if they were dripping. When he would draw rotting corpses, he had such a way of drawing them that there was a little bit of revulsion in you. You could almost smell the rotting flesh. He was so good at horror stuff. What Gaines said in '86 was that after EC closed up shop And because of all the trouble they had with the government, Graham Engels was very ashamed of the horror work he did. And he went into commercial art, and he wanted nothing to do with any of the EC stuff. And there was even a point where Gaines sold the original art from the ECs, and he sent the money to Graham Engels, and Engels sent it back saying he wanted no part of it. However, after that interview, I guess Engels finally relented, saw the different artists who were heavily influenced by him, like Bernie Wrightson. Bernie Wrightson he should have been able to claim Bernie Wrightson as a dependent on his taxes. Wrightson was so dependent on him in the 60s and early 70s that he came back, he accepted the money, and he started doing commissions of paintings of the old witch. He continued to do fine art paintings, but he did paintings of the old witch for fans as commissions, and kind of reconciled himself with what he had done and what had made him popular in the 50s. This story is more of a horror theme to it, but that's because of the art. And it ends with a kind of a horror twist at the end. It's about a man who's got a medical condition, and the pharmacist messes up the medication, and the mess up in the medication helps the man for a while, but then it all falls apart, because that's what happens in a horror story. The third story is a Johnny Craig story. Again, Johnny Craig has that really clean line. This is a story about a caveman who's been found. He thaws out, madness ensues. And then the third story, which is the zombie story, is very much a very standard voodoo story. But again, they're getting more into the horror themes. They're getting away from the crime toward the horror. Johnny Craig had two stories in this issue, which is interesting because he usually would be the person doing the last story, but for some reason he did two stories in this issue. And as I said, this is the last story of the Crypt of Terror. The next issue is the first issue, issue 20 of Tales from the Crypt. The word terror is not on the cover at all. If you look at the cover, Tales from the Crypt, Tales is in huge letters. And EC, one of the cover things that they did, they would have a little, the logo would take up the top third of the comic, and then they would have a little line down the side where they would put a word like strange or terror or horror or whatever, so that if the books, first off, if the books were displayed, you could see the logo, but if they were displayed another way, you would at least see that little cover blurb line and know, oh, it's a terror comic, oh, it's a humor comic, oh, it's a crime comic. This is also the first issue that has the Crypt Keeper on the cover. The Crypt Keeper is in a little balloon, little circle, not saying anything, just a picture of the Crypt Keeper. It does not say suspense stories on the cover. They use that inside the books and such, but it's not on the cover of this issue. And yet another Johnny Craig cover, and it's one where a man is watching someone cutting a gravestone with the man's name, his date of birth, and his date of death, which is today. And as we look down, the inside about the comics code and the books being published, exactly the same as the last issue, except Crypt of Terror is now Tales from the Crypt. Crypt Keeper opens this issue as well. Feldstein opens this issue as well. Again, he's not doing the puns. He's not making fun of the characters. He's just at the beginning and the end of the story, introducing it and then releasing you to other stories. It's called The Thing from the Sea. And this is a walking corpse story. A person on a boat kills someone. The body comes back to life to get its revenge. One of the things about the EC books is if you boil down the plots, that's what the plots of over half of them are. And while it was formula, it was the art, it was the storytelling style, it was the way they would do the twist that drove the stories. The other thing is, if it weren't for the art, if it wasn't for the fact that the art was so good, these stories probably would have faded away, because if you go over to Atlas, Stan Lee and his writers were doing story within about a year or two of this. They were doing stories. They weren't as literary. Yeah, they weren't as tense, text dense. They weren't as well constructed, but the plots were very, very similar. Most horror comics got their plots from EC, and even if they didn't directly steal the plot, they would steal the idea of you kill someone, they come back to life and kill you in an ironic way. But it's the art that brought it up a level above. It's the art that made this stuff so classic, that made it so that people would see this stuff and become such fans of it, and why it has been reprinted over and over and over. It's not because these stories are the greatest stories ever done, or that the stories are brilliantly written or unique. It's the fact that the art was so good. I would venture to say that if a new comic reader were to pick up these books and they were published on really good press with modern coloring, they would enjoy it just as much as the readers of the 50s. The next story, A Fatal Caper, is a Jack Camon story. Jack Camon, while not one of the best known or flashiest DC Comics, Jack Camon was a solid artist. He really excelled in doing stories about pretty girls and love triangles and normal people in extraordinary situations. He was really good at drawing beautiful women. Cayman's women are, you could tell the way he draws women. He has a great way of drawing faces so that his women all look very beautiful. Camon is kind of underrated in the EC artists because he wasn't as splashy, and there are some who didn't much care for his art. I really like his art. I I really can't talk about layouts because the editor would do the layouts, but I thought Camon was very good about ordinary people in extraordinary situations, um, kind of capturing that feel, capturing that emotion, and he was really good at the one thing that EC needed, and that was an artist who could draw normal people having conversations and making it interesting. This Camon story is about a magic spell that goes wrong. So again, more into the horror theme, more into the occult and the magic and the horror stuff, branching away from the crime, moving more toward the EC horror that we would all know. One of the things about this issue is it's got a in the letters page. They give an in-story explanation for why the comic changed from Crypt of Terror to Tales from the Crypt, and they say that it's because the publisher was just too squeamish about the word terror. He didn't like the word terror, so he didn't want it on the cover. And as I said, they don't even have terror in the little corner box. It's strange. And I don't know if it's because maybe they got some complaints from news dealers. I have read interviews with Gaines, with Feldstein, with just about everyone I could find an interview on, and no one ever points toward where and why they changed the name from the Crypt of Terror to Tales from the Crypt. But I will say this, Tales from the Crypt is a much better name than the Crypt of Terror. And Tales from the Crypt is the one that has sunk into the consciousness of people. Another thing on the letters pages that I want to point out is they were almost educating their readers as to what good horror books to read, because they would do things like in this one, the Crypt Keeper's literary suggestions, further listing of my favorite fine mystery literature that you can obtain at your local library: H.P. Lovecraft, Lurker in the Threshold, Boris Karloff and the Darkness Falls, Bram Stoker, The Mystery of the Sea. They'd already suggested the classics everyone knows: Frankenstein, Dracula, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, Edgar Allan Poe, that stuff. They kind of get away from that after this issue, but they really were kind of saying, look, these are other horror stories or mystery stories. And part of it was because readers were writing in saying we want more, but part of it was also to kind of put themselves on that level, to let people know this is the type of thing we're trying to do. And I always find this interesting when comic creators do this. One of the comics of the 80s that I love so much was The Question. And Denny O'Neil in the letters page would give a book on philosophy or a novel that really sort of had an effect on him. And I was I hadn't read a lot of this stuff, so I would go, oh, he's suggesting Zen without Zen masters. He's suggesting Zen in the art of motorcycle maintenance. He's suggesting this mystery series. And as it's one of those things that's gone away, but I think it would be interesting if some of the writers would say, hey, these are my influences. But I also find it would be interesting if some of the artists would say, these are my influences. As I was growing up, as I was learning to draw, I looked to these people. And I find it interesting that EC did that in their early days. The next story is Prescription for Death. It's another story by Graham Engels. It's set in modern era, but boy, it sure doesn't look like it. He really has that look and feel of gothic horror, of that. And this is a really, again, another very simple story. The final story is another Johnny Craig story. This one is just a pure crime story. It starts with an artist drawing the picture of a man surrounded by a circle. And as the artist is out and about, he sees the man he's drawn, um, meets the man and the man's wife, has an affair with the man's wife. The man he had drawn kills him and is hung at the end of the story. So you get the ironic twist. You get the use of, gosh, why did he draw that at the beginning? But there's no horror element to it at all. And I think it's stories like this that would lead Feldstein and Gaines to go, you know what? We should do a crime comic for Johnny Craig, because Johnny Craig did a lot of work in crime suspense stories. The next issue of Tales from the Crypt, number 21, again, picture the Crypt Keeper on the cover, where terror is not on the comic at all. The cover is a Feldstein cover, not a Johnny Craig cover. Feldstein does a few covers now. And we see what looks like a walking corpse bursting in on a man who's reading a newspaper about how a convicted killer is executed, and his last word, he swears revenge on the jury and the judge. When we go to the inside cover, the lineup for EC has changed once again. It's Tales from the Crypt, Two-Fisted Tales, the Harvey Kurtzman book, Vault of Horror. They don't have the Haunt of Fear listed, so they're not listing everything they publish. Weird Science, Weird Fantasy, and Crime Suspense stories. This was pretty much the core of the new trend. The new trend is in place. They have found this type of stories they want to do. Harvey Kurtzman has become an editor. And for all intents and purposes, we are now in the new trend. All of the pre-trend stuff is done. They have moved forward into the type of books that they would publish during EC's golden era. The first story is A Shocking Way to Die, and it's just this beautiful, beautiful, beautiful splash page by Feldstein. And we finally get the true look of the Crypt Keeper. We've got a really good shot of his face. This is the look the Crypt Keeper would have through the rest of the run of EC. This is the Crypt Keeper you would know from the comic. They made slow changes over these issues, and finally they're done with it. Just a beautiful splash. And the Crypt Keeper's tale, again, he's not doing the puns. He's not interrupting the story. But this is a horror story. This is a man is convicted on as he's being executed. He swears revenge on the jury and the judge, and of course he begins killing members of the jury. They're trying to stop this reanimated corpse before he could kill the judge. Just a great EC horror story. Gaines' style is very clean. The layouts are very crisp. It's really, really indicative of the type of story that EC would do. The next story is a Wally Wood story. This one is signed, unlike the previous one. It's called Terror Ride. It's still, Wood had not completely found his style. You can see his style starting to pop up in some panels. You can see the Wood faces. Wally Wood had a very specific way of drawing faces that you can look at it and tell it's a Wally Wood face. This is the story of a couple who goes into like a haunted boat ride that they used to have at carnivals. And as they go through, they find out that it's not wax figures. So again, another horror story. Many of the EC horror stories wouldn't be about reanimated corpses. It would be about crazy, crazy killers. And this is another one of those. The letters page in this issue is not, there are no letters on it. First, it talks about how the voting has gone for previous issues. A lot of comics would do this. They would go, please tell us what your favorite story was. And in every comic, the text story would come in last. No one gave a damn about the text story. I rarely read them when I went through the ECs the first time. I've read some of them. They're you could tell that it was written by someone who, okay, I need to write 500 words. Even when I was a kid reading Dell Comics, and Gold Key, they would have the Donald Duck or the Mickey Mouse or the Goofy text story, and I would read everything, and I would read those stories and go, who cares? One of the things I want to point out, though, is they have the voting, and the first issue, I'm sorry, the first place was taken by Graham Engels. Graham Engels was voted as the best story, even though to Gaines, Feldstein needed that first spot. The fans liked the Graham Engels stuff best. Johnny Craig came in second. Feldstein came in fourth after the two Johnny Craig stories. So while Gaines felt that Feldstein's art was the best, the fans weren't the same. And I think a lot of it's because Feldstein's art was a little stiff. And fans liked Johnny Craig was just really, really good at this point. And Graham Engels, who, as I said, became one of the favorite horror artists, had already sort of developed a style that the fans were really drawn to. The next story is called House of Horror. It's drawn by Harvey Kurtzman. It's not drawn in that Kurtzman style, though. There are some Kurtzman lighting effects, but if you did not know it was a Harvey Kurtzman story, you wouldn't know it was a Harvey Kurtzman story. Again, it's not signed. The thing is, by this point, Kurtzman was already editing over on Two-Fisted Tales. He would then start editing Frontline Combat. So he wasn't drawing for anyone other than himself, other than a few stories here and there. It's interesting to me that he moved so quickly from an artist to an editor, within the first year of EC. The final story is a Witch's Cauldron story, and it's explained in the letters page that because of some chicanery, the old witch will now have a story in every issue of Tales from the Crypt. It's a Graham Engels drawn story. Graham Engels is best known for drawing the old witch. You look at it now and it's boom, right there. He's got the style. She's got her look set. Again, no puns. The old witch shows up at the beginning and the end. It's called Death Suited Him. It's another love triangle. Man falls in love with woman. Woman falls in love with a man with a really good tuxedo. Spurned lover kills the man who's buried in his tuxedo. He believes the tuxedo is why she fell in love with him. Digs him up, wears the tuxedo, and of course dies because of the tuxedo being infused with formaldehyde. The standard tale. Boy meets girl, girl leaves boy, boy steals corpse's clothes and dies because of it. It's a standard tale. The last issue I'm going to go into is Tales from the Crypt number 22. This was the last one from the first year. It does have the word terror on it, and they have changed the logo. In previous issue, Tales was big and From the Crypt was small. In this, Tales is shrunk down, and Crypt is in big letters. This is the classic logo that people know. And in previous covers, you would have the the Crypt Keeper in the little circle. Now they're along the side, featuring the Keeper of the Crypt of Terror, the Keeper of the Vault of Horror, the Old Witch from the Haunt of Fear. It's another Feldstein cover of a corpse reaching out and pulling a man down. There's no text on the cover, it's just that image. Previous issues would have text to kind of tell you what the story was about, to hype that story. This, they're relying just on the art. And again, if you look at it, Feldstein draws the cleanest rotting corpses in the history of horror comics. We start in with the first story is by Feldstein. This is one where the Crypt Keeper shows up in the story to narrate certain portions of it. He's not just at the beginning and the end. And this was one of the things that comes in later in EC Comics, where the host would kind of show up, give transitions, explain things, crack puns, make fun of the character in the story. They're not doing that yet. They're still using it as a character device. They're still using it as a narrative device. But the Crypt Keeper is interrupting the story more and more. There is a pun at the end of the story, which is very much a EC thing. This is yet another story about a corpse returning to get revenge. EC has found its formula. Now they're starting to hone it, starting to refine it, starting to decide what they're going to do with these stories. The next story is Blood Type V, and while it has the Crypt Keeper up at the top, it's very clear that this was drawn before they had decided that there would be a horror host introducing each story. Blood Type V is another Graham Engels story. It's a vampire story, very classic vampire story, not with as much of a twist ending, but more, they're telling vampire stories now. It's not a person who thinks he's a vampire. No, it's a vampire. These creatures are now going to be in stories and going to be thought of as real. One of the house ads is EC fans. We at EC are proudest of our science fiction magazines. Look for Weird Science. And on the cover of this issue of Weird Science they have it's in this issue an adaptation of a Ray Bradbury story. And the reason for that is, as I talked about before, Gaines would bring in these springboards. And he would just write down the ideas. And one of the stories for the science fiction magazines, Ray Bradbury actually read comic books. He enjoyed comic books, and he was picking up the EC stuff, and as he read one of the stories, it was pretty much a direct ripoff of one of his short stories, and he wrote EC rather than saying, I will sue you, I will crush you. He said, hey, I see you adapted my story, but you forgot to pay me. Please send a check for $50 to blah, blah, blah. And Gaines, rather than being Gaines, who, when he saw that, at first was scared, then he went, oh, wait a minute, he just wants to get paid. And he corresponded with Ray Bradbury and said, can we adapt your stories, putting your name on the cover, if we pay you for them? Bradbury, who was a comic fan and became a big EC fan of their science fiction stuff and their art, agreed. And that was how EC did so many adaptations of Ray Bradbury short stories. Just a little side note here. Again, the Crypt Keeper's Corner, the letters page, talks about how all of the hosts are now going to be in all of the other comics. That what the Old Witch did for his comic, it led to this. I think a lot of it is that the horror hosts were becoming very popular. And also they've worked through all the inventory stuff that they had for the crime books and decided they wanted to have more brand cohesion. Also, if Tales from the Crypt is selling a little better than the Haunt of Fear and the Vault of Horror, why not have cross-promotion? Marvel used cross-promotion to unbelievable advantage in the 60s, but EC's using it even though they're doing anthology horror books. This is the Old Witch from the Haunt of Fear. You should go get her comic. The next story is another Jack Camon story. He's doing the Old Witch, the Witch's Cauldron. His version of the Old Witch in this does not look anything like the Old Witch that Graham Engels drew. It's almost funny when I look at it. It's like, I wonder who that's. Oh, yeah, that's the Old Witch, because it's the Witch's Cauldron. This is a story about a roller coaster that is too scary for human beings to ride. Um, Again, not a real horror story, more of a suspense story. Camon does a good job with the circus setting. Um, EC liked those sort of settings. There were a lot of stories in circuses and carnivals and things like that. A lot of stories in swamps in their horror books. The last one is again a Johnny Craig story. Johnny Craig drawing the Vault Keeper, and it has the Vault of Horror. This is the Curse of the Arnold clan, and this is about a family who believes that they are cursed, and every so many generations, one of them will be buried alive, and of course, our lead character is trying to escape that fate. And because it's a horror comic, we all know he doesn't. One of the things about EC is you would think with the number of horror comics that came out and the level of sales of books like Crime Does Not Pay being between 3 and 5 million, depending on what they put on the cover and what you believe. You would think that the EC book sold millions of copies. What Gaines said is that for the most part, his books sold, the horror books sold between 350 and 500,000 copies, which at the time is not huge, but they had large sell through. If the books made it to the stands, they sold, especially the horror books. And other publishers noticed this. By the time EC had finished their first year, Atlas was putting out horror books, Ajax was putting out horror books. Pretty much all of the, I want to say, lower rung publishers. Dell wasn't, DC wasn't, although DC would do their mystery books later. Fawcett wasn't, but pretty much everybody else, including Harvey, including MJS, which became Archie. Everybody was putting out horror books because Gaines's sell-through was so good. We'll get as we get later on, we'll see that Atlas really was flooding the market. Good old Martin Goodman got to flood that market. Um, as I said, these were not the first horror comics, but these were the first ones that really got a foothold in the market. And it's very interesting to me that they only did three. Toward the end of EC's run, they were planning on doing a fourth. They were going to bring back the Crypt of Terror as a book. They were going to introduce a fourth horror host, a female named Drusilla, who shows up in a few of the later issues with the Crypt Keeper. But EC kept it to just three horror books, and they were bi-monthly books. Whereas Atlas and other publishers were, oh, this is selling, let's do 20 of them. As we get to the end of the first year of EC and the first year of Tales from the Crypt, most of the artists are in place. The artists are starting to sign their names. They're being talked about in the letters pages as they go through what story was the most popular, what story was the least popular. Gaines and Feldstein had developed their formula. It would ramp up over the years, where the stories would start to have more gore, more blood, more bodies, be more more bodies. But they would also mix in more humor. I was very surprised going back and reading these for the first time in quite a long time that there weren't the pun-filled introductions in any of these first year's worth of issues. I want to thank you for listening. I know that I went into a lot of detail on specific things, but that's how we're going to do this history. When you're looking at Tales from the Crypt, you can go through and you kind of get an idea of what type of stories they were telling and who the artists were. And then as we go on, we'll talk about what artists did certain stories. Many of the artists became typecast. I talked a lot about Graham Engels becoming the person who did the more gothic horror. As Jack Davis gets into horror, his is more the almost southern fried horror. Wally Wood was moved toward more of the science fiction. As the artists developed their styles, Feldstein realized very quickly what they were best at and would put them on the stories that he felt they were best at. I appreciate all the feedback I've gotten. I was very surprised when I put out the first personal history of EC, the number of retweets and the number of people who hadn't listened to any of my stuff before who emailed me or asked me and said they wanted more history. But they were kind of outvoted by the Kirby folk, and of course my own life of getting other things done. But we're going to be coming back. The next DC history I will be doing will be the first issues of Mad, and then we will go back and do the next issues of Tales from the Crypt. And we're going to go back and forth on those. You can email me. You can call the voice line. It's all talked about in the ads, which I have right here. Pretty much every form of entertainment has advertising, and this one is no different. Our first ad is for DreamHost.com. DreamHost.com is the best web host in the whole known universe. I've been using them for 14 years. They've always been able to help. They have great services. If you need a web page, they are the best. Just go to DreamHost.com, and if you use the code CRAYZ, that's KRAYZ, you get $20 off your first year. Our second advertiser is Graze.com. Graze.com is healthy snacks delivered right to your door so that when you're at work, you can avoid the vending machine. When you're home, you don't have to reach for the bag of chips. It's dried fruit, it's new ideas. I get it every 2 weeks, but you could get it more often. Great food at a great price. And if you use the reward code Cory S3R5P, your first and fifth boxes are free. That's CORY S3R5P. And if you're listening to this here podcast, you're one of the most good-looking people on the internet. And you don't want to trust your skin to just any old razor, so shave with the amazing razors you get from Dollar Shave Club. Every month they send a box with your shave supplies at the beginning of the week, or whenever you want. You can pop in a fresh blade and get that fresh blade shave. It feels fantastic, and it's just one of the many ways that you can maintain the good looks that everyone has come to expect from you. That's Dollar Shave Club. If you go to dollarshaveclub.com/crazy, it kicks a little back. All of these advertisers, they kick a little back to us, so we can wet our beak a little. We're not asking for much. We're not asking you for money. But if you need these things, go to our advertisers. They support this podcast. Thanks. If you have suggestions for Solitaire Rose histories you'd like me to do, anything that I've read or enjoyed, or even stuff I didn't like. I'm looking to do histories on Secret Wars. I'm looking to do a history on Atlas Seaboard. I don't know a lot about Atlas Seaboard, which is why I want to do that history. I really want to dig in to that company that Martin Goodman founded after he kind of got booted from Marvel. And I also am doing another one of my podcasts where I ask people a question. And I'd really like it if the listeners would either email or call the phone line or join me on Facebook and private message me there. The question I'm looking for an answer for is, what do you wish people knew about you? So think about that. Please get back to me with your answers. I'd love to hear what you have to say. And I'll be back next week with more stories.